Hello. Hello and welcome. Welcome to another edition of Atlas Information Live. I'm your host, Atlas Alex. And before we get going today, I just want to welcome you and do a quick sound check. And please let me know if there are any problems with the sound, because if you were here last week, you know that right off the bat, there was a problem with my microphone, and I ended up not being able to solve that problem without completely restarting my system. And actually, even that didn't solve the problem. I had to physically unplug the microphone and plug it back into a different port. So please let me know if there are any problems or if things are sounding loud and clear. Uh, uh, Thumbs up if you can hear me okay. Thumbs up, down, if you can hear me okay or not. All right. So if anybody's watching and oh, Benjamin says 10-4. So okay, so I'm going to take that as a yes. I'm going to assume that you guys can hear me okay. So with that, we can actually get started. All right, clear, good. All right, that's good news. As you probably are aware, well, you can probably tell from the background today, we're going to be talking about the age that we're living in. And you are most likely very aware of the events that took place this week in the United States. The most, the most notable event, if you will, certainly in terms of the media and pundits and YouTube and the general chatter online, and you might say, the fallout from that event. And that was the sudden and very public, let's call a spade a spade. It was the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Now, there are arguments to be made about whether or not what was seen on television unfolded exactly that way, right? There are arguments to be made and allegations that could be tabled as to the nature of that event from a conspiratorial mindset. I, for one, am not going down that rabbit hole, because that to me is missing the point. Whether the event was real or supposedly staged as a so-called false flag operation is irrelevant. It truly is. Because the fallout is the same. The intended effect is the same. And that may sound like I'm suggesting that even if it was a genuine assassination, that it must have been planned, it must have been orchestrated by someone who had an agenda and is now milking the event for all it's worth. And the answer to that question is, of course. But whereas conspiracy theorists will get tied up and bogged down in trying to figure out who is behind it all, they ignore the ultimate answer. There's only one thing behind it all. There can be nothing but one cause. And that cause is the Black Lodge. But the Black Lodge is not out there. The Black Lodge is not people. People, whoever they are, including the alleged shooter, and including everyone on both sides of the aisle that have been attempting to profit politically from the events which unfolded this week. They are all useful idiots of the Black Lodge. Now, hopefully, I don't need to remind you of who and what I am speaking of when I say the Black Lodge. I'm not talking about physical entities. I'm not talking about a secret global cabal behind the curtain. No, the Black Lodge is ego. The Black Lodge could otherwise be understood as the demonic forces of mechanical nature. The Black Lodge is the adversary. And that adversary is not outside. It's not outside of me, and it's not outside of you. You have your own adversary, as do I. And the adversary within you serves the same masters that the adversary inside of me serves. And what they ultimately serve is perhaps best saved for later on in today's discussion. But for now, it's clear whether it was an orchestrated event, that is, orchestrated by intelligence agencies or political parties or movements or whatever the case may be, or it just appears to be this random act of hate, this random act of violence, this very public assassination of a prominent political figure, despite the fact that he held no political office. But he was a prominent political figure in the activity that he partook in and what he stood for and what he argued for. I did not know about him very much until his untimely death. And since that time, the two sides of the political aisle in the United States have been painting the same man with two very different brushes. But it is clear that this figure and his very public assassination is being positioned in a kind of martyrdom, that he is a martyr, and a martyr for a particular set of values. And while I don't wish to get into the weeds, into all of the specific political fallout, it will be important to highlight a few key characteristics, a few signs, and a few key indicators of what's going on, and perhaps that there will be more so-called martyrs for the cause. And how can I say that? Well, just look at history, look at the past. Observe what happened in the during the 60s so-called civil rights movement. And you begin to start listing the figures, the names of individuals who were rather publicly assassinated during the civil rights movement. Now, you can tell me that one person does not a trend make, and I would agree with you. But we would have to take that in a vacuum. But we are not in a vacuum. We do not live in a vacuum. And on top of everything else, we live in a universe, the physical universe, which is governed by physical laws. And one of the fundamental laws of mechanical nature is known as the law of the pendulum. But indeed, that law is a mechanical expression, a physical law which expresses a much more fundamental law, a law which exerts itself or expresses itself in higher dimensions as well. But certainly, in terms of the universe, the law of the pendulum is absolute. It's unavoidable. And we are witnessing now the pendulum swing, a reversal of where the pendulum had been swinging. So it reached a maximum. It reached its zenith on one of its arcs, and now it's reversed its swing, and it's swinging back the other way. And in light of that, we will be able to discern how the present situation and circumstance may be a foreshadowing of what is to come. We have a couple quick comments here. So everybody chimed in and said, clear and thumbs up. And then Benjamin said, yeah, a martyr, as Trump said, is now gonna leave a lot to the imagination to interpret. So let's talk about what is a martyr. A martyr, by definition, is someone who sacrifices themselves for a cause. They martyr themselves upon the altar of something much larger than themselves. Martyrdom, certainly, we can trace its origin back, or perhaps it's most associated with religion and the Christian religion because of all of its saints and its many martyrs. It's the many Christians who suffered and died for their faith. They were said to be martyred on the altar of God. Jesus himself, with his crucifixion, is the martyr of martyrs. He gives us the ultimate example, the ultimate case study of martyrdom. You might even say that the Christ is the living embodiment, like Jesus, the life of Christ and the ministry of Christ. His crucifixion and resurrection represents certainly the Christian ideal of martyrdom, that in giving his life and sacrificing himself to his Father in heaven, to God, he achieves everlasting life. And not only that, the cause, which was so much greater than himself in his own life, was the so-called forgiveness of sins. Esoterically, we know that he changed the karma. He changed the law of karma for this planet. He made it possible for some sins to be forgiven and some sins to be negotiated. And he was able to make that exchange and make that alter that deal with the lords of karma, who manage karma, the great law of cause and effect, and the great balance of the universe. He was able to make that alteration to the rules as they pertain to this planet and this humanity, because this humanity is so fallen, and because we are so trapped on the downward spiral of the alm of life. We are so overwrought and overrun with sin. We are so unconscious. And there is so much corruption in the world that most people contribute to their karma without even knowing it. Most people think that they're perfectly righteous, law-abiding citizens, that they are good people. Meanwhile, they are upstanding citizens, and they are behaving in ways that are perfectly acceptable, perfectly legal, socially acceptable, and generally speaking, widespread among society. And they can go through life contributing and slipping further down on the negative spiral path, the so-called easy path to the wide gate into hell. And on this planet, for this humanity, no matter where you go, that path is so damn easy, and the gate is so wide, and the path is getting more precipitous, and it's getting more slippery, and the gate is just becoming wider and wider and wider. So Jesus, Master Abbottamento, came and embodied the sacrificial lamb, the Lamb of God, and became the archetypal martyr of martyrs for the sake of humanity and for the sake of this planet, that he would suffer so tremendously and he would perform such a tremendous work that he would earn the right, the currency of the cosmos, to be able to try to restore a little bit of balance back for this humanity, a little bit of hope that those everyday mundane sins that humanity is completely incognizant of and completely ignorant of might be forgiven, that they not contribute to and not add to the accumulation of karma, that really in the grand scheme of things, they're rather inconsequential, right? They are what you might call misdemeanors, if you want to use terrestrial legal jargon. right? We have crimes, and then we have misdemeanors, right? These little transgressions that don't really hurt anybody. And so why do they contribute to your criminal record in the cosmic scheme of things, right? Why would they contribute karma to your ledger if they really didn't harm anyone? So Jesus came, and with his martyrdom, he made that possible. And so this is the esoteric scientific definition of martyrdom. And it is one that applies to bodhisattva, the path of the bodhisattva in general. And since the path of the bodhisattva, the path of Christification, leads to the death and resurrection, there's the sacrifice of life for the sake of incarnating the Christ. That is the ultimate universal scientific purpose of the path of the bodhisattva, the direct path, the path of the razor's edge, the path of Christification, the path of the Superman, the path of the pharaonic God-man of Egypt, to be a living embodiment, a living, breathing God. Literally, God made flesh. That's the process of Christification, to become a God-man, as Jesus Christ was after his resurrection. And the martyrdom that enables that, like the death and resurrection, that enables that transmutation, the ultimate alchemical process and the ultimate metamorphosis. We might say is the universal prototypical archetype of martyrdom. And then, of course, the reason is because the embodied Christ, God made flesh, God walking amongst men, amongst mere humans, that is a profound act of humility. That is a profound act of selflessness that God incarnate and suffer alongside his creation and suffer the plight of his children for the express purpose of showing them the way out of hell, of showing them the way out of suffering. And that, of course, is in the 3 days that Jesus was dead, and the time that a bodhisattva, following their death, they descend into the underworld, into hell, is a whole other aspect of that type of martyrdom that I can't even effectively comment on, because, of course, I don't have a direct experience of that. It's just safe to say that however difficult it was, the events of the life of Jesus, and however difficult the crucifixion was, rest assured that the 3 days he spent in hell, and it was much more than that. It was 3 days from our point of view. But you know yourself that you can fall asleep for 5 minutes and have a dream that lasts for hours. You know that time doesn't work that way in psychological hell as it does here. So the suffering and sacrifice that the bodhisattva endure once they descend into hell is perhaps unfathomable to us. But why all this preamble about martyrdom from the metaphysical point of view and its purpose? It has a metaphysical purpose. It has a real esoteric purpose, this martyrdom, because it is how a physical being, it is the only way in which a human can embody the selflessness of God. Right? I'll repeat that. Martyrdom is the only way that a mortal can embody the essence of selflessness that is the true essence and nature of God. And I don't mean that in some metaphorical sense. It's the actual practical way and that is why when we witness someone giving their life for another or giving their life for the greater good or giving their life for something bigger than themselves, greater than themselves, the principled values of universal humanism, the principled values of universal ethics, the values that are common to all who have ever walked this earth at any time throughout history. The universal values of truth and honor and courage and humility and, again, sacrifice. These virtues, when someone sacrifices themselves, we marvel at that. We honor that. We see in that the spark, the essence of goodness that is godliness, because it's selflessness. When you put others before yourself, you do unto others as you would have done unto you, but there's no guarantee that you have a return. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, God gives of himself. The Divine Mother gives of herself. The bounty that is Mother Nature provides, it gives. Yes, it also takes. But when you consider the unbalance, what you receive from nature versus what you have to give back to nature when you die, there's this selflessness, there's this sacrifice present in all of that, on in all of creation. That is the essence of God. That is what we would call the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, the spirit of selflessness. That is what the martyr embodies. The thing is, it's important to spell this out because we need to know what a real martyr is. A real martyr isn't created in the media. A real martyr isn't made into such by the propaganda or by the politics of the day. Martyrdom is a metaphysical scientific fact. It is a truth. And there are people martyring themselves right now all over the world. And you'll never hear about them. And you never see them. But they are being honored as we speak in funerals and ceremonies and church masses or temple masses or the equivalent temple ceremonies, celebrations of life, I suppose we use that terminology nowadays. And there are tombstones and epitaphs and eulogies being written and spoken and carved, honoring and remembering and celebrating their sacrifice, whether they're firefighters or soldiers or police officers or frontline emergency workers or just workers in general who threw themselves in harm's way for the sake of their colleagues or for the sake of the village or for the sake of their community. And even when we witness animals, pets, or farm animals, when we witness an animal chase off a wolf or a bear, or we watch as a dog leaps into a freezing river or into a burning building to save someone trapped in one or the other, right? We witness this, and sometimes those animals die. They succumb to their injuries in the act of saving whomever they were saving, right? The dog that ran into the burning building to save someone, dies of smoke inhalation, but the individual survives because, the it was incredibly taxing for the dog to drag them out, right? And so the dog inhaled so much smoke in the process that the dog, succumbs to smoke inhalation and dies, but the individual lives. Well, that dog is a martyr. The dog is a martyr. Or the dog that leaped into the freezing river to save someone, but caught hypothermia and died. But the individual lived. That dog is a martyr. Because the selflessness that mortal being embodied and surrendered to, that spirit of selflessness, that spirit of I can do, therefore I must do and I must do all that I can do, because in doing so, I can be all that I am. And in that moment, the spirit of the great I am that I am says, I must be a martyr. I must give. I must be the essence of selflessness. I must be that I am. And so I must give all that I am. That is martyrdom. That is martyrdom. Because in the giving all that I am, that includes this mortal self, this life, this existence. I place it on the altar, the sacrificial altar. That's a metaphysical, scientific act of truth, of beauty, of spirit. It is the essence of God being actualized in its highest expression. Why? Because what else is there beyond selflessness? That you have given all that you are, such that there is nothing left for you to give. You have given even yourself, so that all that is left is no self. Nothing. It is that no self that the Buddhists talk about as the highest Buddha nature. Tathagata Garba, or Trenrezig, or some of these other Buddhist words that I have rattling around in my brain, which may or may not be describing what I think they are. But the point is, the no self is that highest state. Well, how do you embody that? There's only one way to embody that. You have to give away yourself. You have to give all of yourself away. That's martyrdom. That's the path of the Bodhisattva. And if you see it through to its ultimate expression, its ultimate manifestation, then you have attained what you seek. To actualize your greatest potential, which is to achieve the highest state of selflessness possible. And the highest state of selflessness possible to any mortal is Christification. To be a living embodiment of the spirit of selflessness. To be a son of man and a son of God. The Lamb of God. The sacrificial lamb. Which is the ultimate act of humility. Because you don't commit acts of selflessness and self-sacrifice. You don't martyr yourself for greatness. You don't martyr yourself to glorify yourself. No, you're destroying yourself. You're reducing yourself. There's no more I there to glorify. That's the whole point. The glory is in the sacrifice, in the martyrdom, and the glory comes to those who embody, who reflect and express that potential within the spark, within the essence, within the 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 atom nous of the monad, of the being. Because inside of us is a Christified master in potentiality. But in order to be one with the Christ, which is selflessness, the embodiment of selflessness, we must embody selflessness. This is not there. This is self-evident, or it should be. And this is why the path of the Bodhisattva, and this is why Christification must involve self-sacrifice, and it must involve martyrdom. It must involve the death, psychological death and physical death. The death of the I, the death of the ego, the death of the self. Because you cannot be one with selflessness if you are still clinging to yourself and your cravings and your aversions and your desires, even if that desire is to be one with selflessness. Right? That's mystic pride, and that's one of the great paradoxes that so many spiritual people get caught up in. And it is one of the great paradoxes that so many who see themselves as messianic figures here to save the world, or they're walking down a pseudo spiritual path in the hopes of glorifying themselves in the process. And what the New Age has sold to millions upon millions upon millions of customers, consumers of information, of my truth, that has essentially told them what they wanted to hear. Yes, and I will ascend, and I will ascend. Ascension is reserved for Christified masters. Ascension, again, it's not some concept. It doesn't mean I go up to the next level. That's not what ascension means. To ascend into the solar absolute, one must be completely selfless. The very phrase, I will ascend, is an oxymoron. No, I will not ascend. I cannot ascend. Mario cannot leave the cartridge. Neither can Link leave the Zelda cartridge. So how does one ascend? Well, first, one must resurrect. First, one must die. Resurrection is the first step to ascension. Resurrection is the middle step between mortality and ascension, between mastery and ascension, because resurrected mastery is quite a bit above mastery. So enlightenment, if you want to say enlightenment is down here and mastery is here, and then resurrected mastery is here, and then ascension is here, and then you become an ascended master, one with the Christ. You've earned your way. You've proven yourself. but not you, but your monad, your essence, your seed, your spark, your being has embodied that spirit of selflessness. All of this is really important for us to understand that martyrdom is on a level of metaphysical science, and it's on a level of factual, experiential cause and effect. It is fair to say, that a great many people who speak out for justice, or what they judge to be justice or feel to be justice, or they act for the disenfranchised, and they speak for the voiceless. We can say that many of those individuals do so in the face of great threat, in the face of great danger, without question. And they receive threats, and they are very often discouraged, or at least that's the narrative that we read about them and or hear about. To what degree that's true is, anybody's guess. It depends on how much you trust the historians and their ability to record history in any sort of objective manner. But occasionally, individuals who are made out in the public eye to have a certain nature, or to be fighting the good fight, putting themselves in harm's way for the sake of the greater good. When an individual like that dies in the line of duty, as it were, it is remarkable how quickly the narrative around that individual as a martyr is propagated. It spreads like wildfire. Now, it's one thing to witness someone knowingly and wittingly putting themselves in harm's way to save somebody else. That, we can recognize that, the nobility of that, the courage of that, the selflessness of that. But have you noticed that people don't make a big deal out of it? We will recognize it. We will honor it. We will respect it. And depending on the level of sacrifice and the scale or scope of the outcome, we may honor them in some way. We may immortalize them in some way. with a shrine or a statue or a plaque or a, some kind of memorial. I suppose the correct term is we will memorialize them or enshrine the memory of their sacrifice. So, of course, you go to military cemeteries around the world, like in Normandy, and you see all the crosses of all of those who gave their lives during the D-Day invasion, etc. So we memorialize them, we enshrine them, and so on and so forth. But then there are those who are victims of political assassination or public assassination. And around their death, there explodes a kind of media and propaganda industry that seeks to profit from their sacrifice, that seeks to exploit or milk the assassination for all it's worth. And the individual is raised to a level that is, well, I mean, let's call a spade a spade. It's really idolatry. They are made larger than life. They are this whole narrative is spun around them, and this whole aura created around them. And some of what has been unfolding with regards to Charlie Kirk is that he is to be given the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously. I've heard that it is probably very likely that he would one day become president of the United States. I've heard all manner of and then there on the other side, from the same camp, we just have he was a champ, he was a family man, he had a wife and his two young children, and he was just a normal guy, and he was just doing the right thing, and so he's trying to make mythical the mundane. The mundane aspects of his life are now being garnished and embellished and made into this mythos around the man. And he was going around and talking about, you know, traditional values or conservative values or Christian values, or, he was a spokesperson for Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And he was there to try to, keep a dialogue going, open a dialogue with whomever, and, keep talking with people. That seems to be what was behind his activity as a political animal. And his assassination was immediately was being framed as that he was being silenced by the left, the radical left, who 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 hate free speech and who hate dialogue and who only want to shut down the debate and cancel people and police speech. Right? This has been a huge theme, and so it seems to make sense that a very, apparently clean-cut family man, simple everyday guy who simply wanted to talk and simply wanted to keep open the lines of communication and was embodying this principled value of free speech in the United States, was gunned down. Um, and what was interesting was on the left, there were many people who came out and publicly cheered that he was assassinated. They publicly celebrated his death on social media in particular. And the backlash against them was swift and harsh. Many of them lost their jobs. Many of the companies that they worked for immediately terminated their employment because they were celebrating the assassination of this individual. There is something in the air around all of this that and if you have been watching YouTube or just browsing, the videos popping up on your feed about this subject and the headlines about it, but this is a turning point, this is an inflection point, this is the beginning of the end, Americans have had enough, that, and so on, and just like on and on and on and on and on. It's just, and then the rhetoric coming out of some of the political leaders, and then there have been, on the left and in the media, there have been statements being made, and then 24 hours later or 36 hours later, those statements are being retracted and apologies are being made. There's something about this event which it is being played up and it is having repercussions and making waves in a way that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. And if we study what is happening out there, we will learn a tremendous amount about our own psychology and about the law of the pendulum. Because the last time anything like this took place was during the civil rights movement, when there was a shift from a very right-wing conservative mindset to a more liberal Yeah, justice oriented, equality oriented mindset. And in the 60s, you think of the individuals who were very publicly assassinated: Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy. And there were others as well. But these were the big names. Certainly were the ones that in which it was said America lost their innocence. And it's so obvious, in fact, that you have images like this circulating online. Kundalini King chimes in here and he says, John Lennon was assassinated when I was at home watching that assassination live on TV. I was at home sick that day. I was ill. I told my mom, I can't go to school today. There's no way. She goes, what's the problem? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what the problem is. I just cannot go to school today. And I watched CBS News and I watched the assassination of John Lennon on TV. But John Lennon's assassination didn't have nearly the effect that the civil rights leaders in the 60s. But we could talk about John Lennon maybe another time, because that's a different kettle of fish. I'm gonna backtrack here and take a few of your comments before we continue. Benjamin says, not only did people not make a big deal about it, a lot of people even celebrated Charlie's death. How disgusting humanity has become. Yeah, so I was mentioning that was one of the fallouts. And Tiffany says, yeah, Benjamin, I was a bit shocked from the reaction. Much of it very disgusting. Agreed. So the point of an event like this, a situation like this, is precisely to elicit these kinds of reactions from the opposition in order to be able to paint them as monsters. So again, understanding the juxtaposition of these two individuals in this image. I didn't create this image. Somebody else made this image, and it's online. It's on some article that's now comparing the assassination of Charlie Kirk to that of Martin Luther King. And so the reaction, because when Martin Luther King was assassinated, rest assured, there were many, many people applauding and cheering and celebrating the death of, I can't repeat the words, but that, loudmouth N-word. And there were people talking like that and referring to him that way. And when they did, they painted themselves, they marked themselves in the eyes of any moderate, rational human being. They mark themselves as monsters, as heartless, soulless, politically motivated, mechanical, subjective, narcissistic, completely selfish non-humans. Because that is a non-human response. That is someone without a soul. That is a heartless, soulless individual. I don't care if that person was your political opponent or not. I don't care if you didn't like what they said. I don't care if they were standing up for people and values and concepts and philosophies that you find abhorrent because you have been indoctrinated into some sort of other form of radical ideology. To celebrate the death of a political opponent and to say, good riddance, it reflects back on you as being completely inhuman. You're completely identified now with the black chess piece that celebrates another chess piece being taken off the board. But you, the player, don't wish the death of your opponent. Kundalini King says, "Hi guys," and he says, "Yeah, the rise of the Christian Reich." You got that terminology from Archaics. He's been posting a lot about the rise of the Christian Reich, and Jason may be onto something there, and how it plays out will be very interesting to see. But Christianity, this wasn't the first time that Christianity was used to bolster atrocities and the agenda of the Black Lodge. We can go right back through history and see many, many, many dark events that were sponsored by the Roman Catholic Church and then later by other Christian sects. So it's a very old playbook. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Benjamin says, yes, Tiffany, it's truly heartbreaking that humanity has sunk so low and shows so little empathy. So for the past 3 weeks, I've been talking about empathy as the only weapon we have against the machines. And basically this week you saw the mechanical left, right? The transformation of the left, of the movement which had been bolstered and strengthened by the assassinations in the 60s, and at once created the welfare state of the modern elite, the modern United States, and the postmodernist agenda in the academies and universities and among the elites, but it also created the notoriously selfish and self-centered and narcissistic baby boomers who were the hippies and the beatniks of the 60s, who then witnessed these very public atrocities, these very public assassinations, and they witnessed the Vietnam War, those atrocities being done overseas, and the Korean War, and they went through the oil crisis, and they went through Reaganomics and the Great Recession. And what you ended up with is the modern day picture today of this highly polarized capitalism socialism dichotomy. But now, as the pendulum, but the hyperbolic capitalism was not, it was the justice, the underdog, the socialist, justice seeking, peace, love, hippie movement that needed to be weaponized. That needed to be radicalized, and that needed to be institutionalized. And it needed to be radicalized, and it needed to be secularized, meaning stripped of its essence, stripped of its spirit, and replaced with hyper-intellectual, mechanistic, political, power-oriented dogma, which could be taught and disseminated not through any organic means, but through the institutionalization of radical leftism through the school system and the academies, the universities. It needed to spread like a cancer. The mechanicity needed to strip those institutions, and many of the institutions of the welfare state were stripped of its essence, of its humanity, of its spirit, of the spirit of charity, of the spirit of looking after your fellow man, of the spirit of looking after the downtrodden and the forgotten and those who have fallen through the cracks. And instead, replaced with a hyper-politicized, tribal, identity-focused, power-focused, intellectual, elitist dogma of so-called social justice and postmodernism, what we call woke, right? Being woke. But the essence, the spirit of it was stripped. And in the stripping, this was in the secularization of that, you had the inversion of empathy was twisted, corrupted, and inverted into narcissism, into self-love, where your empathy, your compassion for others and the downtrodden became your identity. You became a social justice warrior. That is what your identity became. Not a soul feeling compassion for a fellow human being, feeling empathy for the suffering of others. No. You are now an angry, politically motivated, driven, social justice driven, postmodernist, enlightened one. You were woke, and everybody else, the rest of the world, was still asleep, but you were woke. You, the ego, the intellect, the one getting the master's degree or the undergrad degree or master's degree in women's studies or gender studies or whatever the case may be, because you had read all of Foucault and all of Jacques Derrida, and you were programmed and conditioned that all truths are subjective, that all knowledge is subjective, and that you have your truth. And you were fed all the colonialism and the patriarchy and all the rest of it and everything else. And so the mechanical pendulum swung and wreaked havoc. And the assassination of John Lennon was a part of that back in the 80s, because John Lennon and Yoko Ono were a voice that he was worth more to them dead than he was alive. He writes Imagine, and the words are ambiguous enough that the secular left could treat it as a kind of anthem, and they do. But that's because the superficial intellect hears the lyrics being sung and can interpret them as Imagine is an anthem of secularism. It's an anti-religious or anti-spiritual, that it's an anthem of secularism, secular justice. But the reason why they had to assassinate him is because it's not that. It was never that. You have to read between the lines of Imagine. That's why the song was called Imagine. You have to use your imagination. And you have to call upon your imagination to truly comprehend what the lyrics of the song meant. But like all scripture, right? Scripture can be interpreted different ways because of subjectivity and because of the ability of the rational, clever mind to rationalize every false interpretation. And remember that the Black Lodge is all about exploitation. And I feel very strongly that in the case of Charlie Kirk, we have a similar situation as we do with John Lennon. I believe that we had someone who maybe had a few, may have said a few things here and there that he might have regretted later. And that because of the things that he said, that would have made him a political pariah, number one. But secondly, I believe that probably deep down he was incorruptible. I believe deep down he was far too naive, is far too innocent, that he could never have been president of the United States, is because he was far too far too naive to be that. And that he was incapable of the levels of corruption required to be the president of the United States. And that he couldn't actually be a political insider in the Kali Yuga because of what that means and what that requires. So, just like John Lennon couldn't be that, John Lennon couldn't actually be one of the secularist intellectual elites driving and commanding the stripping of spirit from the radical left and the secularization of social justice and compassion in America, and transforming it from empathy and compassion into mechanical social justice and secular intellectualization, secular elitism. He couldn't actually be a part of that. But he could be exploited as a martyr. He could be eliminated and exploited as a martyr. It's the same with the martyrs of the 60s. These were not perfect men. There's not they were flawed men. They were flawed humans. But when you think about Robert Kennedy or John F. Kennedy or Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, they were flawed. And yes, they wanted power, they wanted control, but they wanted the power and control to, in their minds, make things better, and make things better for those who are disenfranchised, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, they couldn't play ball with the powers that be. They couldn't play ball with the big machine because their heart was in it. They had too much heart. They were flawed. They were not men without sin. I mean, we all know, if you've looked into the biographies of any of the men from the 60s, the civil rights leaders, or JFK or RFK, but JFK specifically, we all know about the affair that he had with Marilyn Monroe and everything else, right? So these were flawed individuals. They had their demons, in other words. But you know how I feel about that. You know what I've shared with you before. And what they've known all the way back to the Greeks was Aristotle, who has said there's never been anyone who has shown any sign of genius without also having a touch of madness. Madness comes from demonic possession. That's the origin of madness. It's mechanicity that leads to madness. That's the adversary. And I've explained many, many, many times that the greater the accomplishment, the greater the adversary, the greater the obstacle standing in the way. So when I say these men were not without flaws, I mean it. They had their demons, and they were battling their demons. However, they were battling their demons, and they were actively and openly pursuing a path of love, a path of peace, a path of principled integrity and righteousness for the sake of others. They would not play ball with the big machine. They would not capitulate. They would not lie down. They would not give up their principled beliefs. And so the big machine oriented them a certain way, and the media built them up a certain way, and then eliminated them and proceeded to glorify and exploit and milk their legacy for all it was worth. They were made into martyrs. And the cause that they gave their life for was now injected with this new sense of self-righteousness and anger and frustration and indignation and determination. Their martyrdom gave the social justice movement more fire, more anger. That's why they were killed, and killed very publicly. Now, in recent years, while the whole left-wing thing has been mobilized and radicalized and secularized, the right wing has remained, relatively quiet. The great, unheard, silent majority of the United States living in the Midwest, in the heartland of the United States, they have been unrepresented in the media. They've been unrepresented in universities, their values and so on. But quietly, in their churches and in their communities and online in their echo chambers, their anger and their frustration, their indignation has been festering and growing like a boil under the skin. And along comes Trump to give that anger and frustration and disenfranchised group a political leader. But like any political movement, it needs its sacrificial lambs, especially to the Christian right, or as Jason of Archaic says, and how Kundalini King said, mentioned it here. Where was it? He called it the Christian Reich. Their sacrificial lamb has to be an innocent. It has to be a clean-cut guy, a family man with a wife and kids. And once again, I think with Charlie Kirk, you had someone who was far too naive for his own good. And so he was made into a martyr because of what now this Christian Reich is going to make of him and what they're going to justify. Because there's another individual who was killed, supposedly, and Irina Zarutska, and she just happens to be Ukrainian. And whether or not there's significance of that, considering the Ukrainian conflict and everything else, but But the media made nothing of this. And what's being spun now on right-wing television in the States is that the media made nothing of it because of the racial ethnicity of the suspect, and that goes against the narrative of the media, and so they were downplaying this so-called senseless death. And Trump went on national television flaunting the photos of this woman and her alleged stabber. Stabber, is that even a word? And Trump was holding up these photos in the Oval Office. Let's continue with these chats because we're gonna fall behind. There's a lot of comments here I want to get through. Kundalini King says humanity has sunk. Humanity isn't anything that sinks to a low. And he says humanity isn't anything that has sunk. Humanity can't sink to a low. Maintain your humanity and you will maintain a high level of consciousness. Yeah, so when we say humanity has sunk, we don't mean humanity in sense of human beings. You're right, human beings can't sink. It's intellectual hominids. It's rational hominids. It's the mechanical animal self that sinks. But our humanity can become trapped within unconsciousness, within the subconscious mind, as the animal mechanical self takes over. And those rational hominids who are fallen and asleep, and the ones who are, we call NPCs, the ones without a soul, is because they haven't developed their human soul, and they will never develop their human soul because they're entirely overwhelmed by mechanicity and their rational intellectual mind. And that's what you see in many of these woke people in their reactions online. They're heartless, they're soulless. They don't have a soul. They're incapable of feeling empathy for their fellow human being just because that other human being expresses different intellectual beliefs. So what that effectively means is, in their mind, it does not compute. That person is my enemy. They're my political enemy. And if they die, I'm going to celebrate that. It's the same phenomenon that takes place in war when soldiers in the modern era go through training that turns them into machine-like entities, killing machines that have zero empathy for their opponents on the battlefield. This was not like that in the olden days. Even in World War I, even in the trenches, in hell incarnate, in hell, because the trenches in World War I were hell. And there were days at Christmas time and during New Year's, during the First World War, when the frontline soldiers who had been for months, shooting at each other and doing raids through the barbed wire and firing mortars and the mustard gas and all the rest of it. There were times when at Christmas time they started, or New Year's, they started singing, and their mortal enemies just a few hundred yards away heard the singing and joined in. and in the singing of hymns, of songs of celebration, of revelry, celebrating Christmas and the holidays and peace and love, and singing, "Oh Holy Night," and these hymns, they climbed up out of the trenches. And they came and they embraced one another as brothers, as human beings, recognizing that they were there to do a job, that they were duty bound to their nation, they were duty bound to their superior officers, and that in accordance with whatever worldly rules and laws that had been set down, that they were rightfully there to kill each other, but they never forgot their humanity. And in that moment of soulful expression of the deep longing for peace and for love and for, brotherhood amongst men, they came up out of the trenches and they embraced each other. And if they had wine or beer or whatever, for whatever, because it was Christmas, they raised a glass and they shared it with one another. Mortal enemies who only days, if not hours before, were still shooting at each other. And as you go back in history, and you see this, it's not just a matter of Hollywood glorification or whatever, or the romanticization of this. There have been barbaric times throughout history, but conscripts in war were just farmers and young men. They were never trained professional soldiers, to become programmed, heartless, soulless killers. And so throughout history, you have stories like this, where there was honor amongst warriors, honor amongst soldiers, and that there were rules of engagement. And there was this whole thing, including during the Napoleonic Wars and during the other wars in the 17th and 18th century, where there was still a sense of that these are still human beings over there that we're shooting at and that are shooting at us. That's not to say that atrocities didn't happen. But today, the reason why people are grumbling about and rumors are beginning to bubble up regarding a civil war in the United States, at least, and in the West in general, is because, despite the fact that there are no guns being fired in any official capacity, the vast majority of adherents to the left-wing radicalized left, the radical socialist agenda, they're all heartless, they're all soulless. Because in their mind, the opposition, the patriarchy, and the conservative values, the traditional values of society that are patriarchal and oppressive, are they're not real human beings either. So you have this is what I mean by by the secularization and the stripping away of spirit is that this is like bleaching the spirit, the soul out of humanity. So when you say humanity isn't anything that has sunk or can sink, you have to understand that a humanity is a union of divine and mortal, of divinity and mechanicity that are playing this dance. And in the Kali Yuga, you call it like social engineering here. In the Kali Yuga, the Black Lodge rules, mechanicity rules. And it seeks to dominate because by it dominating, the only thing that can follow is entropy. And that's what the Kali Yuga is all about. It's all about civilization being weakened and crumbling and falling apart, coming apart at the seams and crumbling at the foundation and being weakened. This is what my book was all about. That's why I named it The Great Awakening. The Great Awakening of humanity. So we must be careful with our words, but we must never allow ourselves to be naive and say humanity cannot fall. Not that which makes us human, but a humanity is more than just that, just a soul. We are more than just a soul, here and now as mortals. And if the mechanicity, if the animal self overwhelms and dominates the soul, then yeah, the soul becomes trapped. And I've done programs on this before. I called them, when I was talking about the Hasnamusen, right? Half man, half beast. That's the centaur, right? The top half of a man and the bottom half of a goat. Half man, half beast. That's the Hasnamusen. But because of the downward spiral of the Ulm of life, eventually, even if someone is 50-50, eventually the animal self takes over. And let's face it, this humanity is 97% ego. It's 97% animal. This humanity is fallen. And there are many, many, many souls in hell. And you can't say that they haven't fallen. They have fallen. And they are asleep. Their consciousness is asleep. And they're dreaming in hell. And what they're dreaming are the horrors of hell. They're having nightmares. Benjamin Raphael says, I'd say these are troubling signs. Something is clearly happening that's diminishing us as human beings with all the events we're witnessing. And the reason why I'm emphasizing the relationship between what's happening now on the right, and I think that Charlie Kirk is just the first. I think there will be more. There will be others, just like there was John Lennon eventually, but there was MLK, Malcolm X, and RFK and JFK. And I think that their significance in the abbreviated the abbreviations of their initials, they all ended with K, except for Malcolm X. But MLK, RFK, and JFK, there was some significance to that 3 Ks. And it may have something to do with the white men in white sheets, but that just may be a coincidence. All I know is that what you see happening now, the pendulum is swung. That was from the 60s all the way through till now, galvanizing and crystallizing the woke movement and the secularization, the weaponization of empathy and the weaponization of compassion into the intellectual movement called woke and postmodernism and radicalized socialism. Now the pendulum is swinging back the other way. And now we have the first martyr of the right wing, what Jason and others here are calling the Christian Reich. And now they're going to have their martyrs. And so it's going to bring with it now you're going to see, and I think Jason, although I haven't watched much of Jason's material on the subject, my intuition tells me that Jason would say that they're going to weaponize Christianity. They're going to weaponize faith. And blind faith at that is going to be weaponized. In the same way that empathy and compassion, which are essentially spiritual in nature, they're not connected to any religion. On the right, the spirituality is very much, certainly in the United States, certainly in the West, tied up in Christianity. And so there, religion is going to be weaponized, as it has been in the past. And yes, there's going to be a new Reich rise on the right. And it is faith, it is religiosity, it is Christianity that is going to be, or what passes for Christianity is going to be weaponized. And at the same time, it's going to be secularized. Now you might say, how does one go about doing that? Well, it's been done before, where there's a transfer. And the first, to create idols, worldly idols of worship, and to transfer the loyalty and the faith and the devotion of your followers, to transfer their loyalty and devotion to Christ and transfer that to the world of men, their loyalty and devotion to the church. So the Catholic Church did this very successfully when through the papacy and through all of their saints and all of their martyrs. So they had all of these feast days where people would celebrate and worship the martyrs of the Catholic Church. Now, there are many cynical historians and secular theologians who will say that Jesus himself was an invention of Rome. And I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but you don't need to completely invent the man and his entire history in order to exploit him and turn him into the martyr that he became for the Catholic Church. Because as you know, the Catholic Church teaches, and all of Christianity teaches, that Jesus died for our sins and that all you have to do is believe in him and all of your sins will be forgiven. That is not true. That is not the case. But that is the narrative that they ran with. The narrative that they ran with is Jesus as martyr. And that Jesus was born the Son of God. And that he was born to die for our sins. They don't know that Jesus was born a man. And he had the potential, he had the destiny to do the things that he did. But he didn't become the Son of God until he fulfilled his work. Until he performed the necessary scientific cause to produce the effect of becoming a living embodiment of the selflessness of Christ. And that most of the miracles and most of the teachings and most of the stories in the Bible that follow were after his crucifixion. They spent 40 years traveling in India and Tibet, becoming a master of Kabbalah and Hinduism and Buddhism. which is why so much of the Bible had to be redacted by Constantine and by the early theologians. So if he was a complete fabrication, then they never would have had to undertake the Council of Nicaea. So the revisionist history that is being applied to was applied to Malcolm X, MLK, JFK, RFK is now being applied to Charlie Kirk, and it's furthering an agenda on that side. Kundalini King says, I'm not diminishing as a human being. A human being isn't something that can be diminished. A human being is an attainment. No, I agree with that. But a human being and a humanity are two different things. Kundalini King says, your heart was broken. Says, my father always talked about the JFK assassination and how it affected him deeply as a teenage boy, as it did so many others. I mean, it was a horrific, and it was really, for many people, the death of hope. The hope died that day, right? For many people. Tiffany says, yep, it solicited a reaction out of me on many levels and for many reasons. Black magician behavior all the way. And that's really part of the black magic of it all, is that these psychologically traumatic events that rock us to our core, in that, when we are shaken in that way, things that have been dormant inside of us can become dislodged and come to the surface. And many of the kinds of anger and frustration and fear and desire for control that have been laying dormant can be triggered by such triggering events. And that's why these types of events, including 9/11, are black magic rituals that are designed to stir the passions of those who have been asleep. And a few more assassinations of this kind on the right, and you will see a full-blown awakening of the American Midwest and rural America, which has been largely ignored and forgotten and patronized by the coastal elite for decades, and they've been made fun of in Hollywood movies as being uneducated hicks, and trailer park trash and all the rest of it, and white trash and all the rest of it, and men in particular, white males in particular, that have been completely humiliated and demasculinated, cucked is the other word, emasculated, and a few more carefully planned events like this, and they will be mobilized, and they can be mobilized and recruited into a very, very powerful force for a violent seizure of power. Let's put it that way. Kundalini King says, Martin Luther King was viewed as a communist. It wasn't racism as much as it was political. And he says, if you are reactive, you have work to do. We seek to always be responsive. That's true. He says, expect the unexpected. In all honesty, this was expected. And he says, Kundalini King, I love you guys. It's very refreshing here. Kundalini King says, Tiffany, I understand. And he says, Tiffany and Benjamin, Attlas is a great teacher. Here we can mature to grow. Everything is going to work out. Benjamin says, totally agree. Attlas is a great teacher, and I'm sure things will work out. Wow, geez, okay. Okay, I got more to catch up here, so I'm going to go through them. He says, good to chat with you, Ben. I haven't been here for live streams. Good to chat with you too. Glad you're here. Benjamin says, how offensive could someone's words possibly be to justify killing them? That's my question to the left. How can I explain this in a very simple way? To those people on the left who have been through university, they have all been conditioned to believe that words are violence and that ideas are oppression, and that the white man is the root of all evil in the world. They believe this. To them, it's a dogma. It's not religious dogma, but it's secular religious dogma. To them, it's sacrosanct because they have gone through an entire education system that has been hammering this into them their entire life. And they've grown up in a world run by the baby boomers, which have largely been white men. And so, and all of these like crimes and atrocities that have taken place around the world were largely the work of white men. And so it's the patriarchy, it's the white male heterosexual patriarchy that is the root of all evil, and money and their desire for money and power, that's the root of all evil. And so we must wrestle it away from them. And so when you say, how offensive could someone's words possibly be to justify killing them? They look at people like Charlie Kirk as the West looked at Goebbels, right? Right? If Trump is Hitler, and they constantly make the comparison between Trump and Adolf Hitler, then Charlie Kirk was like Goebbels, because Goebbels was Hitler's propaganda maestro, right? He was the one responsible for the Nazi propaganda machine. And Charlie Kirk, while he wasn't responsible for or in control of any propaganda machine, but he was the voice and face of Republican ideology and beliefs and so on, and traditional conservative values and conservative Christian values. And he was very public about that. And so his words, because words are violence, any words that oppose your beliefs and you are on the side of truth and justice, right? And conservatives don't believe in safe spaces. Conservatives don't believe in using people's preferred pronouns, et cetera, right? You have to understand that these people grew up in a world where they needed safe spaces on campus to be able to go, where they would not be confronted with anything that went against their worldview. Someone expressing an opinion which rattles them, which upsets them, which opposes, which does not compute in their secular elitist intellectual framework of reality, their postmodern subjective ideological belief system. they have been taught to believe that that constitutes violence. They have been conditioned and taught to believe that if somebody says something that upsets them, they have been traumatized by that other person. They are now a victim of violent speech, of hate speech. And the degree to their trauma is the justification for physical violence, for first the public cancellation of that other individual, the seizing of their bank accounts, the silencing of their voice, the being thrown in prison or being exiled from society and being cut off from the rest of society, and barring that to be silenced in the ultimate manner. Because when you associate in your mind and you make the association that Republicans and conservatives are Nazis, then just like the judges at the Nuremberg trials, they feel wholly justified and completely righteous and justified in hanging the perpetrators of atrocities. The perpetrators of Nazi atrocities were hanged after the Nuremberg trials. So if you have been conditioned to believe that everybody on the right are all Nazis and that all the atrocities in the world are their fault, and all the pain and suffering you feel and all the pain and suffering that all the disenfranchised minority groups have suffered are all atrocities and are all traumas that have been perpetrated by the equivalent of Nazis, then why wouldn't you place yourself in a modern day position of being the Nuremberg judges and saying that you are justified in eliminating and executing the perpetrators of atrocities? Now, I'm just trying to help you step inside the shoes of someone who has been so indoctrinated, radicalized, and programmed by a secular religion. But we could very easily have the same conversation about, I don't understand why a young man in the Middle East would strap an explosive vest to his chest and go into a crowded public market, yell Allah Akbar, and blow himself up, taking dozens of innocent women and children with him. We could have the same conversation. I don't understand. How offensive could the people in that market be to that young man that he would choose to go and take his life in such a manner that it would maximize the carnage and suffering of others? We could have the same conversation. The details would be very different. The particulars would be very different, but the process of indoctrination would be quite similar, we would find. And the rationalizations and the justifications, we would find the psychological mechanics would be very, very similar. And we could perform the same comparative analysis across the board, including the cult of Charlie Manson and the Manson murders, and all sorts of cults throughout history that have radicalized, indoctrinated its members and radicalized them to become violent. And the radicalized left, they are violent. They are violent, but they're also cowards. which means that they wait for the violence to occur and then they cheer for it from the sidelines. Right? They don't actually have, for the most part, they don't actually have the courage. Most of them are women to begin with. Like most of the individuals on the radical left, if you've noticed this, most are women anyway, and women are not prone to undertaking such acts of violence. It's just not, generally speaking, not in their nature to do so. I don't know of any women mass murderers, for example. I don't know of any women women who have undertaken the assassination of others. There have been women who have committed murder, but usually the women who commit murder it's second-degree murder. There have been cases of first-degree murder by women, no question. But even then, even in those cases, the murder, it's often like they're killing their husbands or, jilted lovers or whatever, and it's like they're poisoning them, or it's, you know what I mean? It's like, anyway, women are far more passive aggressive than they are aggressive. That's the point that I'm trying to make there. But when you ask this question, it's, on the surface, it looks like it's just somebody offending somebody else, and then they're justified in killing them, but that's the surface level. You need to dig into the complex psychological narrative that has been driven into these people for decades, that they've been indoctrinated into, such that you hear offensive words, they hear violence. That's the key. Tiffany says, Kundalini, it's okay to have reactions, even shock, when one bears witness to a brother being murdered. I understand you. Feeling doesn't always equate to work needs to be done. And Kundalini King says, of course, Tiffany. Let's be clear. When Kundalini King says, if we have reactions, then there's still work to be done. He's not referring to, like, if somebody sneaks up on you and like, startles you, right? Well, there's work to be done. Yeah, okay, sure. But that's like a knee-jerk reaction, right? Like that's like a purely mechanical, instinctive, right? It's not that you're going through life scared and afraid that people were labeled, that you get shocked at something or something startles you, right? What Kundalini King is referring to is a type of reaction that people had to Charlie Kirk's shooting, where they reacted with glee, or with rage. That's the reaction that Kundalini King is referring to. As for shock, there is a response to novelty, a response to surprise that is completely legitimate. If you go through life without the capacity to be surprised or to be in awe, then something is missing, something is wrong. And to be surprised, to be able to take in completely unexpected circumstances that, and you have those moments like it's surreal. Like when you say shock, you're not, it's, you can say it's a reaction, but really it's a response. It's both. But it's not an ego reaction, right? It's ego reaction is anger, frustration, greed, envy. These were the reactions that were eliciting that comment of you still have work to do. So this is what Tiffany says, there are acceptable reactions, and these reactions just make us open to the full spectrum of experience, and to the full spectrum of experience as an individual, as a consciousness experiencing reality. Because if you shut yourself off, like I say, if you shut yourself off to surprise or awe or wonder, like wonder is like you don't know. It's like I wow, it's just like you're in awe, you're wonder, you're like in amazement. That's a kind of reaction. But to react with fear at what you don't know, right? Or disgust, or or uh, repulsion because of something you don't get, or rejection, like aversion, right? That's the kind of reaction that Kundalini King is talking about, that we have to work on. So I hope that clarifies it a bit more. But it's a good point. It's an important point, but we can't take it too far, because if we turn ourselves into Mr. Spock, then we're just, what's the point of living? Right? If you experience everything with complete blasé, and there's like, you have no change in your temperament whatsoever, then what's the point of existing? Now you might argue that, well, that's how the gods experience things. I know that not to be true. I think that there's a kind of again, a kind of mystic pride and a kind of mystic intellectualism, a kind of mystic conceptualization or theoretical idea. It's like there's a spectrum of experience, a spectrum of conscious experience, and a spectrum of conscious responses, that how the consciousness can respond to events. And many of them flow through us and can express as or appear to be a reaction on our part. But if it's not coming from us, but if it's coming through us from our higher self, then it is a response. It's just that requires discernment to be able to know the difference. But we mustn't just paint everything with the same brush and say, oh, well, there's more work to be done. Of course, there's more work to be done. There's always more work to be done. That goes without saying. But that work is not to try to, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We want to be childlike, not childish, but still childlike. That's right. The ability to play, the ability to enjoy, right? And so to enjoy, to and to marvel and to wonder and to be amazed and to be shocked, to be surprised. These are part of the full spectrum of conscious experience. Rest assured that the gods too can be surprised. They don't know everything. They don't. Because if they did, none of us would be here. There wouldn't be any point. There would be no point. Because experience is about seeking. And one of the things that we seek is novelty of self-evident experiential knowledge, as yet unexperienced experiences. Anyway, hopefully I didn't dwell on that too long. It was an important point, and it came up, and I just thought, there's this, I don't want to let that one slide. Kundalini King says, my brother was murdered in 2018. Well, I'm terribly sorry to hear that, Kundalini. He says, in St. Louis, shot in the face by a black man. And Kundalini King said, I responded. Well, fair enough. Tiffany said, big hugs in that experience, Kundalini. That's heartbreaking. Benjamin Raphael says, I'm so sorry for your loss. That must be incredibly painful, Kundalini. And he said, painfully for who? My brother? No, painful for you and everyone who loved him. And Kundalini says, I'm not in pain over it anymore. I responded. I did not react. Mutaga says, things will get worse. Forces will continue stirring up division over decades of or years. This will blow up. It is almost inevitable. Unfortunately, it may not be. It may not take decades. It may not take decades. It might, but it might not. Kundalini King says, things will get worse for some, better for others. And he says, I'm in the heartland. This is where the real power is. Guns are flying off the shelves and the churches are at full capacity. Yeah, you see, this is what I'm saying, right? This is what I've been saying, is that, a couple more events like Charlie Kirk and the churches full of individuals with guns are going to empty out, and they're going to go and they're going to take back the United States. Benjamin Ochoa says, Great Britain is in a march behind Charlie Kirk. Not sure if it was yesterday or today. And Mutaga says, we have a saying in the East, when a kingdom is divided in two, it is already destroyed. Yeah, you know what? Very aptly put. Kundalini King says, we have a saying in the West also. Kundalini King says, united we stand, divided we fall. Absolutely. And Benjamin Ochoa says, yeah, I see Christianity being weaponized, how it's tied political, it's enough leverage. And Kathy says, YouTube notifications are not working. YouTube is absolutely terrible when it comes to notifications. Do not rely on YouTube notifications. I'm always on Sundays at 2. Put it in your calendar. Don't rely on YouTube telling you that I'm live. Okay, the last few comments came up saying, united we stand, divided we fall, and Mutaga said, once a kingdom is divided in two, it is already destroyed. This ties in directly into, Kathy says, I'm late. Well, welcome, Kathy. Nice to have you here. But like I said, you can't rely on YouTube notifications. You got to just put it in your calendar or whatever. This comes to what I was saying about divide and conquer. We're living in an age of divide and conquer. And I'm going to pull this down now. I think we've looked at that enough. We need to look at the image behind me, because if we understand harmony and union and unity, the act of creation is an act of union. Masculine, feminine, and union of masculine and feminine. That's creation, the law of three. Well, if that's creation, then destruction, entropy, must be the opposite of that. To destroy, you unmake that which was created. And to unmake that which was created, you reverse the process. So that which was united, you divide. And that's why we end up with, phrases like that. United we stand, divided we fall. Because united we are one family. Well, let's start, okay. One couple, one marriage, one family, one community, one tribe, one village, one city, one province, one nation, one people. Divided, we are what? You just keep breaking it apart in smaller and smaller and smaller units until eventually you end up with the remnants of all great civilizations, which are little factions of tribes eking out a subsistence existence and returning themselves back into nature and brute primal tribalism. And that's all the Aboriginal people all over the world were all once members of hive civilizations. And in fact, the great apes, all of the great apes are former humanities, members from past humanities that have devolved into what you see today, that share 99.9% of their DNA with us. Well, that's why, because they were once humans. That's why they shared their DNA with us. So I expressed this in the video that I made on Human 3.0 and about Human 2.0, binary duality, about the pendulum that swings between opposites, and that in mechanical nature is, despite you have these extremes, it's analog. So there's this tolerance. We call it tolerance in engineering and in mechanical nature, that when you're putting something together, when you're dealing with analog reality, there's a tolerance, there's a give and take. It doesn't have to be exact digital perfection for a screw to go into a nut, or right. Or when you're trying to align pieces of metal or pieces of wood, there's something we call a tolerance there. It's wiggle room, in other words, wiggle room. But the more mechanical you become, the more digital you become. The more the 1 and 0 wants to express absolutely, the more extreme the pendulum swings, in other words, to the two opposites. It stretches the boundaries and the limits of tolerance until the limits of tolerance break, snaps, And the bridge that would have divided those two, through which the pendulum swings, now breaks, now snaps, and you fall into intolerance. The connection between the two extremes that were still connected through this thing that we call tolerance, now that tolerance has been severed. It's snapped. You've stretched it too far. And like a rubber band that snaps after being stretched too far, now the two things are truly divided. They're not connected by anything. There's no tether connecting them anymore. And it's the nature of that pendulum that it starts off rather small, moving back and forth as things are, but as they move further and further apart, it's this pendulum that keeps knocking them back further and further as it swings back and forth between them. This is why we have Master Samael said we must have a quick and flexible mind. We must be flexible in order to remain tolerant. Like, you know, the old cliche about the palm tree and why in tropical areas the trees are like palm trees. They bend in the wind, right? They have a great deal of tolerance. They're able to go with the flow and bend into the wind, or with the wind rather, so that they don't snap. If a tree is too rigid, doesn't matter how hard that tree is. It doesn't matter. It could be made out of a walnut, right? It doesn't matter if it's too rigid. If a strong enough wind blows, it'll just snap because it lacks tolerance. It is intolerant. And it is that intolerance that leads to violence. And it is that intolerance. And what is intolerance, right? It's the inability to bend or accommodate. It's the inability to compromise. It's the inability to recognize the right of others to believe what they want to believe and say what they want to say. It's being too mechanical and too rigid that makes one intolerant and fragile. The more rigid you are, the more fragile you are. And we know that for a fact because we have things like Tupperware and we have tires on cars made out of rubber, precisely because we need the give, we need the flexibility and the durability of rubber in order to be able to drive around. If they were made out of a harder material, there would be zero tolerance and they would be bursting all the times. Tires would. It's the same with Tupperware. You can throw Tupperware in your backpack. You can throw it in the dishwasher. You can throw it in the sink. You never have to worry about it breaking because it's like flexible plastic rubber or whatever it is. Well, or if you make something out of silicone or whatever, right? It doesn't melt if it gets too hot, and it doesn't crack if it gets too cold, and it's very tolerant, it's very flexible. So indoctrination and secularization, codifying in ever more strictly defined parameters, galvanizing, right? We say like something is written in stone. It's dogma. It's absolute. It's now very inflexible. And the people who are indoctrinated into having those beliefs or those behaviors or those philosophies, worldviews, they say it has to be this. They're very inflexible. They're very intolerant of other ideas, of other worldviews. And when the winds blow on them, they feel the strain and the stress because they cannot bend in the wind. So they feel like they're going to snap, and some of them do snap. And you see them when woke people on the left snap, you see them, they lose their mind. They start throwing hissy fits. They start having temper tantrums. They start screaming at the top of their lungs. Like it was a meme for months, for years, since Trump first won the election, but way back when. And you had those images of these woke women screaming at the top of their lungs, like a primal scream, like their very soul had been murdered, like that they were burning in hell because somebody won an election. Here's the thing. On the left, these intellectuals and so on, and these postmodernists and everything, yeah, they break down and they have, you know, they throw temper tantrums and they have their marches and they might even, riot or whatever they do. But on the right, where was it? They're armed. They organize. They congregate. They pray. And they pray for righteous deliverance. They pray for God's justice. And social justice warriors, no matter how righteous they think they are, and for what greater good they're fighting for, or whatever, they're, they're pacifists, which makes them passive aggressive at best, like Gandhi, like the social justice movement of the 60s was passive aggression. It's attempting to gaslight and shame the powers that be into change. But on the right, they're not pacifists. They've been pacified for far too long. And if they are now mobilized, angered, if you poke the bear and awaken that bear, here's Kundalini King himself. Says, here, I'm in the heartland. He said, this is where the real power is. Guns are flying off the shelves and the churches are at full capacity. Not only are the churches at full capacity, I guarantee you that a lot of the guns flying off the shelves start with the letters AR and the numbers 15, and the clips that are being bought are at full capacity. And that all of the people with bomb shelters and bunkers under the farm or under the house, their shelves are at full capacity. So the pendulum is now swinging the other way. They've radicalized the left. Now all they need to do is do the same playbook, more or less, the same mechanisms, the same tricks, the same tactics, but on the right. Now, I did promise you that I would relate all of this back to our own psychology. And I spent a great deal of time at the beginning talking about what true martyrdom was. And I did that to juxtapose so that you could see the difference between true martyrdom and the martyrs that are created by history, by media, by propaganda, for political reasons, for various different reasons. Now, how does this relate to us? The Hermetic Principle states, as above, so below. That means as without, so within. That which we witness in the world, rest assured, that's only possible out there in the world because it's possible in here and in here. In our psychology, when have we made martyrs of ourselves for our own gain? When have we made martyrs of ourselves and crafted elaborate narratives, elaborate stories, songs of sacrifice, of justice, of self-righteousness in honor of our own martyrdom? When have we allowed the martyrdom of ourselves to be the fuel for anger and frustration and indignation and rationalization, to commit all manner of crime, to seize power and control, to advance our interests over and above the interests of others? And when have we done all of that in the name of our own, in the name of honoring our own martyrdom? There's another word for that. There's another expression that's very popular, and we all know, we all apply it to the woke people all the time. We call it victimization. When we see ourselves as a victim, but not just any victim, we see ourselves as a victim of the unrighteous as we stood tall for the righteous cause. And we suffered for it. We became a victim of somebody else or something else, a victim of circumstance, or a victim of bad luck, or a victim of injustice. And we use our own suffering and our own victimhood to justify and rationalize our anger, our desire for revenge, our desire to take action now and take control and command back of our own life. We know by virtue of witnessing the the extreme and radical examples of this in others, we see that the victim mentality is actually fueled by a kind of narcissism, and that these two elements are present in both sociopaths and psychopaths, who, as I said, are incapable of empathy for others. All their empathy is reserved for themselves. They can feel their pain, and when they're humiliated, and when they're being taken advantage of, and when they can feel that, but they can't feel others' pain. That's a psychopath, and to a lesser degree, a sociopath. And these are narcissists. These are completely self-centered individuals who have been wronged, and if they go out and die for a cause, they literally see themselves becoming a martyr, but something inside of them has already been martyred. Something inside of them has already died for the cause. So this is why you can end up having young men strapping explosive vests to their body and going and blowing themselves up in crowded markets. Because once somebody accepts the narrative of the ego that they have been martyred, that they are already a martyr for something greater than themselves, then you can convince them to go and martyr themselves physically for the sake of killing others. And this is a kind of self-psychological breakdown that the US military and other militaries use, and indeed cults use, that psychological breaking down of the former self and then building up this new conceptualized self. But this form of martyrdom, victimization, and narcissism based around that, it's all takes place in the ego. It's all just ego. It's not real martyrdom. Because real martyrdom is a metaphysical scientific fact. It is a fact of metaphysical cause and effect, is what real martyrdom is. And we all know it. We can all see it. We can all sense it, as I said at the beginning. When you see a true act of martyrdom, you know it. Nobody needs to build it up. Nobody needs to create a narrative around it. It is what it is, and everybody knows it. We can honor it. We can respect it. We can memorialize it. But we don't idolize it. Why don't we idolize it? Because no ego wants to be martyred that way. So what is the kind of martyrdom that we do idolize? The kind of martyrdom that's crafted by media and propaganda. Those are the martyrs that we rally behind and around and use to feed political movements and to feed our indignation and frustration and everything else. Why? Because there's no way that our being will allow a genuine martyr to feed ego that way. Now it will. People do it all the time. And that's what I'm saying. Like this is the real danger of what we're talking about here when we talk about this this Christian Reich. I lost track of the where the I lost track of the comment. It was here earlier. Here it is. Christianity is going to be weaponized. But you see, there's the thing. It's like, it's very hard to weaponize genuine martyrdom. But it is twice removed. It can be used to rationalize and justify our self-righteous indignation, what we call our righteous anger, in the case of propagandized martyrdom. Because, look, Charlie Kirk is not a martyr. He's not. He's just not. Charlie Kirk did not die for anyone that day. He didn't. He didn't. He died senselessly. He was assassinated for no reason, for no good reason. His death was senseless and pointless. The lords of karma are not clamoring to make a space for him in the supernal worlds. Why? Why would they? But he's being made into a martyr. It's the same with John Lennon. Same with MLK and RFK and JFK. These were very flawed individuals. They were not masters. They were not enlightened masters who were on the walking the path of the Bodhisattva. Charlie Kirk is not going to be resurrected in 3 days, just as MLK wasn't, RFK wasn't, JFK wasn't. They weren't on the road to becoming resurrected masters, and they weren't on the road to becoming ascended masters. It's questionable how many of the martyrs in the Catholic Church are genuine martyrs. It's questionable how many of the saints in the Catholic Church are genuine saints, if that's even a concept, even anything real. For certain, the Catholic Church used their deaths and their lives for political purposes. And some of those saints may have been on the path of the Bodhisattva. Some of those martyrs may be genuine martyrs. And some of them may have even become resurrected masters, like Joan of Arc. But there is a difference between genuine martyrdom and the martyrdom of what I was calling the new media, but now it's discussed only because of the internet and everything else. But the internet is blowing this up in a whole different way, in a way we've never seen before. But that's the difference between a genuine martyr and a false martyrdom. And within yourself, You need to know what that difference is so that you know who or what is motivating any so-called self-sacrifice on your part. Because if you feel a victimhood and a martyrdom inside of yourself for righteous indignation and anger and for all of this elaborate narrative around it, and you realize that you are being divided and conquered, you're being manipulated, or you're manipulating yourself, you're using and exploiting something in order to get something. Whereas the spirit of true martyrdom is selflessness. True martyrdom is giving all that you are for nothing. For nothing. That's what sacrifice means. That's what selflessness means. But when the mental process and the emotional process of any kind of negative circumstance or the loss or you having to give something or give up something, if the mental emotional process includes calculations of how you can benefit and what you will gain by that loss, and what you have given is blown up out of proportion, and what you have to gain is blown up out of proportion, or your anger and indignation at the others who took from you is blown up out of proportion. Now you know you're dealing with exploitation. Now you know that you're being divided and conquered, or your relationship with others is being divided and conquered. This should not be any surprise, considering that there are such things as false prophets, there's false gurus, there are the Black Lodge creates dark, shadowy facsimiles of truth and light and beauty and honesty, right? They create dark, twisted, corrupted versions, right? We have fallen angels, we have demons pretending to be angels. We have false gurus, so it should come as no surprise that we have false martyrs and manufactured martyrs and narratives of martyrs and martyrdom, which are simply exploiting tragedies and untimely deaths in order for material, political, worldly gain. And if it happens out there, it happens in here. And we need to be aware of that. And we need to be cognizant of the difference. And we need to be sure that we are not committing that fraud within our own psychology. And we want to be sure that we recognize the events that have recently taken place and that will continue into the future and see it for what it is. It's the Black Lodge playing out a very old playbook that's been played over and over and over again. Because remember, mechanical nature is all about formulas. It's all about repeating patterns. It's playing from the same playbook. It knows what works. And it's not going to reinvent the wheel. It knows what works. It's done it before, and it's going to do it again. And it radicalized and mobilized and secularized the left. And now the pendulum is swinging the other way, and now it's going to do so on the right. And when you have a bunch of heartless, soulless, indoctrinated, dogmatic individuals, their empathy and compassion, their desire for justice has been secularized, and it's just a dogma, and it's just a mutual hatred and intolerance, and one of those sides has guns, well, it's somebody said earlier, it's sort of inevitable. It's sort of inevitable. So we must, like Kundalini and Tiffany were discussing back and forth about reactions versus responses. We must try to remain calm and face these situations with equanimity, because it's the Black Lodge doing its job. It's mechanical nature doing what it does. It's the law of entropy at work. But there is a third way, a middle way. And that is to get off the pendulum. And the pendulum swinging back and forth. We want to be at the top, where the pendulum hangs from the string, in the 0 point, observing the pendulum swinging back and forth, but not riding the pendulum and not identifying with either zenith, and not getting caught up in the stretching of tolerance until it becomes intolerant. We want to remain in the 0 point, in that point of stillness, and encourage others to find that point of stillness within them and come and join us as we sit and observe as possibly our nation tears itself apart, possibly as the West tears itself apart, possibly as the world tears itself apart. And this is also what Kundalini King was saying, is that we have a lot of work to do to be able to sit with equanimity. We can marvel at it, we can wonder, we can be surprised by it, we can be shocked at this or that event taking place. But we must not allow our shock or wonder or marvel or to be hijacked by our ego, by fear, by anger, by envy, etc., etc. And last but not least, if you are here on the path of the razor's edge, then know that what it takes to embody the spirit of selflessness inside of you is to be selfless. And that means to be a martyr, to die for something much greater than yourself. But a true martyr, one who was not going to be celebrated, who's not going to be lauded, who's not going to be talked about in the social media, or none of that. All right? Martyrdom, like martyrs don't care about that. They don't care about exaltation. They don't care about being worshipped. So we have to beware the trappings of the false martyrs and everything that we've been taught and everything we've been conditioned to believe about martyrdom. Martyrdom is not about that, because the dog that jumps in the burning building to save a child is not worrying about how they're going to look on social media. And that's a dog. So let us have at least the wisdom of a dog leaping into a burning building or a freezing river. Let us at least do that. And then we can observe with kind of awe and wonder the false martyrs and those exploiting the tragedies for political gain, and witness how the mechanical forces of divide and conquer do their work on the world. And observe it all, not judge, just observe it, and use that knowledge and apply it to ourselves within, and make sure that we're not kidding ourselves and that we're not playing out these same political games in our own psychology. There were a lot of chatter today in the chat. Any more comments or questions that anybody wishes to share? As you may imagine, I had not planned for this to be today's topic. So but it happened. And it was just like many of you, as I became aware of reactions on both sides of the aisle, I was like, well, I can't let all of this just, be water under the bridge. There's just too much at stake, and there was just too much opportunity to learn from all of this. And because genuine martyrdom is something that is so outside of our everyday experience, unless we work in those kinds of professions where, throwing yourself in harm's way for others' sake is part of the job description, right? Unless we experience that day to day, martyrdom and self-sacrifice on that level is just not something we generally experience. So at least here we had the opportunity to see the false propagandized martyrdom and use it as a springboard into a comprehension of what genuine martyrdom is and the difference between the two, because you have to be able to compare and contrast opposites to know its nature. So Benjamin says, thanks for sharing your insights on what's happening on the world stage. Social media seems to be dividing people and pushing us to take sides, but what really matters is staying observant. And as I said, what it all seems to be indicating and suggesting, right? So it's, we can say it is what it is, right? But yeah, it's if there's an escalation, and if there are other figures like this, or maybe a little bit different, then we'll know that it's it's precipitating. Benjamin says, and not falling into these psychological traps, rising above the swing of the pendulum, so to speak. I just feel so sorry for the left as it's turning into more of a cult. Well, the thing is that the right is already that. They just don't know it yet. They just haven't been activated. So the pendulum is now swinging back the other way, and the activation, but the right already is that because the the Christian, the born again Christian, like the Christian mega churches. This is something that I think Jason is right about, and Kundalini King, I think, would agree with this. Is that the the conservative Christians in the United States, they already are indoctrinated into a kind of a cult, and it's just that they haven't been weaponized yet. They're organized, they're armed, but they haven't been mobilized yet. It's the left that has been weaponized and attacking the foundations of all that they hold near and dear. And now they have a martyr to begin rallying around. So a few more things like this, and a few more incidents, and and people on the left overstepping their bounds or whatever, or some other catalyzing, triggering event, and they will be mobilized. They can be mobilized. They will become activated. Right now, it's like they're a sleeper cell. They need to be, when they're brought online and they're armed, that's when we're going to see what we were talking about earlier in terms of divide and conquer, and united we stand, divided we fall. And what many people have been talking about is the like an impending civil war in the United States, because we are talking about armed individuals. Tiffany says, thank you, Atlas, and yes, you're a great teacher. Love all that you do and how you've chosen to serve. Well, thank you, Tiffany. I'm working on that, how I've chosen to serve part, because yeah, well, I've talked about it before. So working on more stuff, but it's a little slow going because I've been overwhelmed by my father having passed away just over a month ago, and me having to organize and arrange all his final arrangements was one thing. But now I find myself alone in a house with a whole bunch of stuff, like decades and a lifetime worth of stuff that now I'm responsible for dealing with and getting rid of. And then the house itself, right? So that's a whole other, you know, uh it's kind of weighing me down because it's very worldly, right? It's stuff. It's material stuff. And it's just like a logistical nightmare. And I'm by myself, and I don't drive, and so it's me having to and I've got pressures from family members to sell it, and so on. I think I'm going to donate a lot of it, but some of it I can't donate. I'm going to have to pay for somebody to come and haul it away. So anyway, so I have more of these worldly concerns, right? Stuff, material concerns, and it's like weighing me down because, of course, I'm eager and anxious to get on with what I'm here to do, which is decidedly otherworldly in nature. So, but I still, I still have this like hanging over me, like the sword of Damocles, all this stuff and all this junk, but it's not because I'm here alone in the house. I'm responsible for dealing with it. So anyway, so it's all slow going. There's more for me to do. In other words, I thought I was off the hook when I finished my father's final arrangements, but it turns out I'm not. I have some more responsibility here to the estate that I have to discharge. And so that means everything in terms of my service and what else I'm here to do in terms of Atlas Conscious Arts, etc. It's going to be slow going, and I'm not putting it on hold. It's just that I have to balance it out with other priorities and other responsibilities. So that unfortunately seems to be just a fact of life. And so that's been weighing me down a little bit because well, it's stuff. And they have that expression, the things you own end up owning you. Well, I don't own any of this stuff really. I own very little of this stuff. They weren't my possessions. But now I have to deal with them. so there you have it. Listen, anybody have any more comments or questions? If not, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to spend your Sunday afternoon here with me, and I hope you all have a great week. It really is. Well, we're halfway through September, so October is fast approaching, and fall will soon be upon us. Hope you're enjoying the fall harvest wherever you are. Try to take advantage of all of the fresh local produce while you can, and try to enjoy all the nice weather while it's still here, and the fall weather and the changing colors of leaves if you can. Maybe it's early where you are. Here, the leaves are just starting to turn. So Tiffany says, nope, all good. Take care, everyone. Have a great week. And Kathy says, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Have a great week. I hope to see you next week. And until then, as always, inferential peace. Take care, everyone.